I used to believe that avoiding fear was a sign of strength. I convinced myself that if I could just sidestep the things that made me uncomfortable, I could somehow outsmart the fear. But no matter how fast I ran or how cleverly I avoided those uncomfortable situations, the fear was always there, lingering in the shadows, waiting for the moment when it would catch up to me. It was only after embracing the wisdom of Stoicism that I realized something profound. Avoiding fear only gives it more power. The Stoics understood that fear is a natural part of life, but they also knew that it doesn't have to control us. Instead of running from it, they taught that we must confront our fears directly, face them with courage, and learn from them. In fact, they believed that the things we fear most are often the very things we need to face in order to grow. Fear isn't something to be avoided. It's an opportunity for strength. This is where so many of us get it wrong. We're taught to see fear as something negative, something to be conquered or escaped. But the Stoics saw fear as a teacher, a signal that there's work to be done within us. Running from fear only magnifies it, while facing it reduces its power over us. If you want to live a life that's free from the grip of fear, you must learn to stop running. Instead, follow these 8 Stoic steps to confront your fears head-on with wisdom, courage, and resilience. These steps won't just help you overcome fear, they'll transform your relationship with it, turning fear from an enemy into a powerful ally on your path to self-mastery. The truth is, you can't run from fear forever, but with Stoicism as your guide, you don't have to. Step 1. Acknowledge your fear without judgment. The first step in stopping your flight from fear is deceptively simple, but often the most difficult. Acknowledge it. Most people react to fear by either avoiding it or denying its existence altogether. The Stoics, however, believed that the only way to conquer fear was by facing it head-on. But here's the key. They didn't see fear as something to be condemned or judged. They understood that fear is a natural human response, and the goal wasn't to eliminate it entirely, but to manage it wisely. Fear, when acknowledged without judgment, loses its hold over us. When we judge ourselves for being afraid, we create an additional layer of stress and anxiety. You might think to yourself, "I shouldn't be scared of this," or "Real Stoics don't feel fear," but this only adds shame to the equation. The Stoics would tell you that this self-criticism is not only unhelpful, but it's also completely unnecessary. As Epictetus said, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the view they take of them." Instead of resisting the feeling of fear or labeling yourself as weak, start by simply observing the fear as it arises. Take note of where it shows up in your body. Is it in your chest, your stomach? Do your hands start to tremble? Breathe deeply and allow the fear to exist without trying to push it away. You are not your fear. You are simply experiencing it, and this distinction is crucial. The Stoic approach to fear is all about detachment from the emotion itself. The emotion can exist, but it does not have to define or control you. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself to examine his fears and emotions from a rational distance, viewing them as part of the human experience rather than as indicators of something being wrong with him. By doing this, he trained his mind to react with calm rather than panic when fear arose. You can practice this by journaling about your fears. Write down what you are afraid of and explore how rational or irrational these fears are. Ask yourself, what is the worst thing that could happen if this fear came true? Often, you will find that even your greatest fears are not as catastrophic as they seem. When you acknowledge fear without judgment, you begin to see it for what it really is, an emotion, nothing more. It's not a prophecy, and it's not a permanent state. It's simply an alert system telling you that there's something in your life that needs attention. Once you acknowledge it, you can begin to work with it rather than letting it control your actions. Step 2. Break your fear down into manageable parts. Once you've acknowledged your fear without judgment, the next step is to break it down into smaller, more manageable parts. Fear often feels overwhelming because we see it as one massive, insurmountable obstacle. The Stoics were masters at deconstructing challenges into smaller, actionable steps. Seneca said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." This is where the power of perspective comes into play. Let's say you're afraid of public speaking. The thought of standing in front of a crowd and delivering a speech might feel like an insurmountable mountain. But rather than seeing the event as one massive, anxiety-inducing ordeal, the Stoic approach would encourage you to break down the fear into its components. What exactly are you afraid of? Is it forgetting your lines? Is it the judgment of the audience? Is it the fear of failure? Once you identify these smaller fears, you can address them one by one. If you're afraid of forgetting your lines, you can practice memorizing your speech in sections. If you fear judgment, you can remind yourself that the opinions of others are beyond your control and therefore not worth your concern, a core tenet of Stoic thought. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself that other people's opinions are not his business. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. By breaking the fear into smaller parts, you reduce its power. What once felt like an overwhelming burden now becomes a series of smaller, solvable problems. It's like looking at a giant boulder blocking your path and realizing that, with patience and effort, you can chip away at it until it's small enough to move. One of the key ideas in Stoicism is the distinction between what is in our control and what is not. When you break down your fear into parts, you can more easily see which aspects of the situation are within your control and which are not. For instance, you cannot control how others perceive your speech, but you can control how much you practice, how well prepared you are, and how you choose to respond to your nervousness. By breaking your fear into manageable parts, you take away its overwhelming force. You no longer feel like you're facing an impossible task. Instead, you're facing a series of smaller challenges, each of which you can handle step by step. This process not only reduces your fear, but it also builds your confidence and resilience in the face of adversity. Step 3. Reframe your fear as an opportunity for growth. One of the most powerful Stoic strategies for dealing with fear is to reframe it. Instead of viewing fear as something purely negative, see it as an opportunity for growth. The Stoics believed that challenges and difficulties, including fear, are essential for developing virtue. In fact, they would argue that without fear, discomfort, or hardship, there is no room for growth. As Epictetus famously said, difficulties are things that show a person what they are. When fear arises, it's easy to fall into the trap of avoidance. Most people naturally want to escape situations that make them uncomfortable or anxious. But by avoiding fear, you're also avoiding the chance to grow stronger, wiser, and more resilient. Marcus Aurelius often reflected on the fact that obstacles aren't just to be tolerated. They are the way forward. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way, he wrote. In other words, the very thing you fear is likely the key to your growth. To reframe your fear, start by recognizing it as a signal that you're standing at the edge of your comfort zone. Instead of seeing this edge as a barrier, consider it as a threshold to a new level of personal development. What skills could you develop by facing this fear? What could you learn about yourself by stepping into the unknown? Let's say you fear making a difficult decision that could change the direction of your life. The decision might feel daunting because it involves risk. Perhaps you could fail, or maybe you'll regret it later. But the Stoics would ask you to reframe this fear. Instead of focusing on the potential negative outcomes, ask yourself, what will I gain by making this decision? What qualities, courage, decisiveness, resilience, will I cultivate by moving forward despite my fear? Reframing your fear in this way shifts your mindset from one of avoidance to one of growth. Rather than seeing fear as a stop sign, see it as a green light, guiding you toward opportunities for becoming stronger and more capable. Every time you confront a fear, you become more resilient for the next challenge. This is how true Stoic strength is built, not by avoiding fear, but by embracing it as a necessary part of the path to virtue. In practical terms, you can start reframing your fear by identifying the lessons or strengths that might come from facing it. If you fear a tough conversation with a colleague, for example, recognize that this is an opportunity to practice assertiveness, honesty, and emotional control. If you're afraid of making a big life change, reframe it as a chance to cultivate bravery and trust in your own judgment. By shifting your mindset, you take control of the narrative and transform fear into fuel for personal development. Step 4. Visualize the worst-case scenario, negative visualization. The Stoics had a fascinating and highly effective method for dealing with fear known as negative visualization. Instead of trying to ignore or push away the fear, they would actively engage with it by imagining the worst-case scenario. This might sound counterintuitive. Why would you focus on the worst that could happen? But the Stoics understood that by confronting the worst-case scenario head-on, you diminish its power over you. Seneca wrote, "He who suffers before it is necessary suffers more than is necessary." Negative visualization is not about being pessimistic or expecting bad things to happen. It's about preparing your mind for adversity so that if or when it does happen, you are mentally fortified and less likely to be overwhelmed by it. The Stoics believed that most of the suffering associated with fear comes not from the event itself, but from the dread and anticipation of it. By visualizing the worst outcome, you take away the uncertainty that often magnifies fear. Let's say you're afraid of losing your job. The fear of the unknown, what would happen if you were suddenly without income or security, can be paralyzing. But by practicing negative visualization, you can mentally walk through the worst-case scenario. Imagine that you do lose your job. What would that look like? How would you survive? What steps could you take to manage the situation? Could you rely on savings for a few months? Could you reach out to friends or family for support? Would this actually be a catastrophe, or could it be an opportunity to find something better? By visualizing these worst-case outcomes, you strip away some of the emotional weight attached to them. Often, when we look closely at our fears, we realize that the imagined worst-case scenario isn't as terrifying as it initially seemed. In many cases, even the worst outcome is something we can survive and perhaps even learn from. This technique also helps you cultivate a mindset of resilience and adaptability. If you've already visualized the worst that could happen, you're mentally prepared to face it with calm and clarity. When the Stoic philosopher prepares for potential hardships, they are not thrown off course when those hardships arise. Instead, they are ready to meet them with a level head because they've already been there in their mind. Negative visualization is a way of taking control over your fear. Rather than letting fear fester in the back of your mind, creating anxiety and stress, you bring it out into the light. You examine it from all angles, and in doing so, you reduce its power. This doesn't mean you expect the worst to happen, but if it does, you'll be prepared to meet it with strength and composure. Step 5. Focus only on what you can control. A foundational teaching of Stoicism is the distinction between what you can and cannot control. This idea, championed by Epictetus, is one of the most practical tools for dealing with fear. When fear grips us, It often stems from obsessing over things that lie beyond our control: outcomes, other people's opinions, external events. But the Stoics teach us to redirect our energy toward the only thing we truly have power over: our own actions, thoughts, and responses. To practice this, start by accepting that the outcome of any situation is not fully within your control. What you can control, however, is how you respond to it. Epictetus said, "Some things are in our control and others are not." It is only after you have faced this fundamental rule and learned to distinguish between the two that inner tranquility and effectiveness become possible. Imagine you're facing a fear of public speaking. What if you stumble over your words? What if the audience doesn't react well? While it's easy to spiral into anxiety over these uncertainties, the Stoics would remind you that you can't control the reactions of others or every detail of what might happen. What you can control is how well you prepare, your mindset as you step onto the stage, and your willingness to speak with clarity and confidence. By focusing only on these aspects, you gain more mental clarity and lessen the burden of fear. This principle is especially powerful when applied to fears about the future. We often fear events that are beyond our control: economic downturns, political changes, personal losses. While these things may indeed happen, no amount of worrying can prevent or alter them. What you can control is how you prepare for possible outcomes and how you carry yourself when faced with adversity. This shift in focus frees up mental energy, reduces anxiety, and makes it easier to confront your fears head-on. Focusing on what you can control also means letting go of attachment to specific results. As long as you have acted with virtue and integrity, the outcome matters less. In Stoicism, it is the effort that counts. You may not be able to control whether your business venture succeeds, but you can control how hard you work and how you conduct yourself. You may not be able to guarantee a positive outcome in a relationship, but you can control how you communicate and treat the other person with respect. By centering your attention on the controllable aspects, you begin to live more in the present, reducing the anxiety that often comes with fear of uncertain outcomes. The power of this mindset shift cannot be overstated. It's liberating to realize that much of the weight we carry is unnecessary. By focusing on what's within our sphere of influence, we take responsibility for our lives without trying to control the uncontrollable. This doesn't eliminate fear, but it does make fear more manageable and less paralyzing. Step 6. Detach from the fear of loss. One of the biggest sources of fear is the fear of losing something we value: our health, our relationships, our status, or our material possessions. The Stoics understood that this attachment to external things often leads to suffering. As long as we tie our happiness to things that are outside of our control, we will be vulnerable to fear, anxiety, and disappointment. To truly live without fear, we must learn to detach from these external attachments. Marcus Aurelius said, "Receive without pride, let go without attachment." This Stoic principle urges us to hold the things in our lives lightly, recognizing that nothing is truly ours to keep forever. Whether it's wealth, loved ones, or even our physical abilities, everything is subject to change. By accepting this reality, we reduce the power fear has over us. Detachment doesn't mean we stop caring about the people and things in our lives. Rather, it means that we recognize their impermanence and do not let our peace of mind be dependent on their presence. When you detach from the need to hold on to things, you become less afraid of losing them. You can enjoy what you have without being enslaved by it. Consider the fear of losing a job. If your identity and self-worth are tied to your professional status, the thought of losing that job can be terrifying. But the Stoics would encourage you to reflect on the transient nature of all things. Jobs come and go, just like everything else. By detaching from the idea that your job defines you, you can approach the situation with more calmness and flexibility. You will still work hard and strive for success, but your sense of self will not be shattered if things don't go as planned. This detachment is especially important in relationships. We fear losing loved ones, and while that fear is natural, the Stoics would remind us that clinging to relationships can cause more harm than good. If we love someone without trying to possess or control them, we can experience a more genuine connection. Seneca said, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." By detaching from the fear of loss, we reduce the suffering that comes from worrying about potential outcomes that may never happen. In practice, this means regularly reminding yourself that everything in life is borrowed. Your health, wealth, relationships, and achievements are all gifts, not guarantees. By embracing this perspective, you build resilience against fear. You can face the possibility of loss with grace and acceptance, knowing that you will remain whole even if things change. Step 7. Embrace failure as a teacher. One of the greatest fears that holds people back is the fear of failure. We are conditioned to believe that failure is a sign of weakness, a blemish on our character. But the Stoics viewed failure very differently. To them, failure was not something to be feared, but rather something to be embraced as a vital part of growth. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." In other words, what you fear, the potential for failure, can become the path to your ultimate success. Failure is one of the most potent teachers in life. When we fail, we're forced to confront our limitations, recognize our mistakes, and adapt our approach. The Stoics saw this process as essential to becoming wiser and stronger. Epictetus would remind his students that every failure offers a chance to learn, and that the real danger lies not in failing, but in failing to learn from it. Embracing failure doesn't mean becoming reckless or indifferent to outcomes, but it means redefining your relationship with failure. Instead of viewing it as something to avoid at all costs, see it as a necessary step toward mastery. When you internalize this Stoic approach, failure loses much of its sting. You stop viewing it as a catastrophe and start seeing it as an opportunity to sharpen your skills, expand your knowledge, and toughen your resolve. For example, imagine a project at work that didn't go as planned. Instead of dwelling on the disappointment or worrying about what others will think, the Stoic would encourage you to ask, "What can I learn from this?" Perhaps you realize there were better ways to approach the problem, or maybe you uncover weaknesses in your strategy that you hadn't seen before. This reframing allows you to take ownership of the experience and transform it into something constructive. Stoicism also teaches that failure is never final. No matter how significant a setback feels in the moment, life always offers another opportunity to act, to improve, and to grow. In this way, failure becomes an essential part of the process of refining your character and abilities. By embracing failure, you become less fearful of it. The act of trying and learning from mistakes becomes more important than the fear of falling short. A person who has overcome the fear of failure is someone who acts boldly and decisively, unafraid of making mistakes. By adopting this mindset, you will not only become more resilient, but also more courageous in pursuing your goals. Embracing failure is not just about bouncing back, it's about using every stumble as a stepping stone toward greater success. Step 8. Practice self-command over your reactions. Stoicism teaches that while we cannot always control what happens to us, we can control how we respond. The true measure of a Stoic is their ability to command their own reactions in the face of adversity. One of the core ideas in Stoicism is that we should strive to respond, not react, to the challenges life throws at us. In doing so, we maintain our inner peace and reduce the grip that fear has over us. When faced with a difficult situation, it's natural to feel fear, anger, or frustration. However, the Stoics understood that while these emotions may arise, we have the power to choose how we respond. Marcus Aurelius emphasized this when he wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." This principle of self-command is crucial for overcoming fear. Fear often leads you to react impulsively, making decisions from a place of panic or anxiety. But if we can step back, take a breath, and choose a deliberate response, we regain control. By practicing this level of self-command, we are no longer at the mercy of fear. Instead, we become its master. For example, if you face a sudden job loss, your initial reaction might be panic or despair. These emotions are understandable, but they are not helpful in finding a solution. A Stoic would advise you to acknowledge the emotions but not be ruled by them. Instead, focus on what can be done next. Take the time to reflect, assess your options, and respond in a way that aligns with your values and long-term goals. In this way, you prevent fear from clouding your judgment and steering you in the wrong direction. Self-command is like a muscle. The more you practice it, the stronger it becomes. Start with small moments of frustration or fear in your daily life. When someone cuts you off in traffic, or when you face an unexpected delay, instead of reacting impulsively with anger, practice pausing. Take a deep breath and remind yourself that these external events are beyond your control. What you can control is your internal state, how you choose to respond. Over time, this habit will extend to bigger challenges and fears. This Stoic practice not only helps you handle fear, but also strengthens your sense of self-control. It's empowering to know that no matter what happens, you are always in control of your response. The more you practice this, the more unshakable you become. Fear loses its power when it no longer dictates your actions. You can face challenges calmly and with a clear mind, knowing that your response is your choice, and that choice is rooted in wisdom, not fear. By practicing self-command, you cultivate a calm and deliberate approach to life. Fear may still arise, but it will no longer control you. You'll learn to handle even the most daunting situations with composure, and in doing so, you'll unlock a new level of personal freedom.